everybody. Thank you for coming to this session and just making sure you're in the right place. We are on local wealth building and delivering inclusive economies. My name's Sandy Brunton. I am here with a couple of different hats. I'm chair of Development Trust Association Scotland, and I'm also chair of the Mull and Iona Community Trust, so I've come from Mull to do this. So I'm quite interested in the more remote and far away kind of places. So what we've got just now is we're going to have I think similar to the earlier session, so we're going to have a couple of stories really, and then we're going to have the chance for you guys to talk individually, and then if we can pull that all back together again. But it might be a wee bit flexible in between that as well. So who we have here is Neil McInroy, and I'll let him explain who he is. But first of all, Ted Howard is the co-founder and president of the Democracy Collaborative, USA in brackets. So I'm going to hand over to Ted first of all, and he's going to give us a bit of his story and what he's been doing and what is it that keeps him going and what's right and what's wrong, and then we'll go to Neil.
Great. Well, hello everyone. I hope you can understand my accent. It's kind of from the Midwest of the United States. It's kind of plain. This is my first visit to Edinburgh. It's the first time I've ever been in a rugby stadium. I've never seen rugby live, but I'd love to stay around for that. So, as was said, my name's Ted Howard. I co-founded a not-for-profit NGO organization about 20 years ago called the Democracy Collaborative. Most of our staff is in Washington, D.C. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, in the Midwest. I moved there 7 or 8 years ago to do a piece of work I'm going to tell you about. And then we have a number of staff in other locations in the United States. Let me, there are kind of 4 things I want to go through with you quickly. First, just my basic perspective. I think it'd be helpful for you to know this. As I was listening to the talks earlier today in the session I was in, I really believe that what we are talking about, if we're talking about inclusive growth, if we're talking about kind of rebuilding the basis of our local economies, we are really talking about system change, very fundamental at the local level. We're not merely talking about projects, programs, an occasional initiative, doing some good work. The truth is we live in communities. We live in nations as well, but for this purpose, we're looking at place. We live in communities that are made up of residents, of institutions and structures, of relationships among those institutions, of policy regime governing all of this, and those systems produce outcomes. So the global system that we have now, we should not be surprised that the outcome we are producing all over this planet is escalating wealth inequality and escalating climate change. That's what the system is producing because of how it's organized. And you may not agree with that, but that's certainly my perspective. Similarly, I believe in our communities are organized in ways that produce certain kinds of outcomes. What we're talking about here are different sorts of outcomes we want our towns, our cities, our communities to produce. And if that's the case, I don't believe we'll get there with some nice projects and programs. We need to look at the actual system and how to restructure it to get the kinds of outcomes we want. So that's my bias. You may or may not agree with that. As we looked at this in my organization about 15 years ago, we looked at economic development. This is a particularly United States lens, so let me be clear about that. But it may pertain in some ways here. I certainly know it does down in England because I've done a fair amount of work there. We looked at how economic development is done in cities and rural areas and so forth. And we saw that there were certain kinds of principles that underlie traditional economic development. One is that if we can just grow the bigger economy, surely some of the benefits will trickle down to those most in need. I live in a community, a neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio that's 98.5% Black, African American. 40% of my fellow residents in this neighborhood of 20,000 people live below the poverty line in the United States, and quite a bit below. I can tell you that the benefits of larger growth are not trickling down and hitting the street where I live for my neighbors. Indeed, in my neighborhood, the average life expectancy for a male, a black male, is 64 years. 8 miles due east, in a white suburb of Cleveland, the average life expectancy for a male, a white male, is 88 years. 24 years of life difference within 8 miles, closely correlated to levels of poverty, income, and wealth inequality. So this idea that place matters, it sure does. So we looked at what's an alternative approach to economic development. We coined a term of art, and the term of art is community wealth building. When we created that about 15, 16 years ago, I did a search. I don't even know if Google was around in those days, but whatever the search engine was, Netscape or something, I did a search for the term community wealth building. Literally, I came up with 0 hits. I was delivering a lecture 2 nights ago at the RSA in London, and I did a Google search for community wealth building, and up came 218 million. Now, a lot of that will be duplicates and nonsense and so forth, but this idea of a new approach to economic development is taking place. It is one that emphasizes the importance of place, not just trickle down, the importance of broadening ownership over capital to build a more democratic economy, that people who, when they go to work, can also own a piece of the action, not just individual entrepreneurs, but all working people. The importance of leveraging our existing assets like universities, hospitals, cultural centers, city governments, municipal authorities, to buy local, to invest local, to keep money pumping in the economy, and the importance of getting a multiplier effect. Even in a poor neighborhood like mine, there's a fair amount of money moving around. It just keeps leaving the system. So how do you keep your money local to get a multiplier effect? So that brings me to a demonstration project, a pilot that we began, and it's why I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and it's called the Evergreen Cooperatives. I was invited by a local philanthropy to come to the city of Cleveland, even though I'd only been there once before, to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Museum. But they liked our ideas, and they said, would you come and help us think through an economic inclusion strategy in our low-income neighborhoods? And so ultimately I ended up moving there. And the strategy, very simply, was to work with the large universities and hospitals and other place-based anchor institutions, and Neil will be talking about this in a UK context, and convince them that they should move their contracts and buy locally to benefit the local community. We did an assessment and found that just 3 of the big institutions, 2 hospitals and the universities, purchased $3 billion US of goods and services every year. And yet they were surrounded by 6 neighborhoods with 50,000 residents, 40% of whom live below the poverty line. But there's $3 billion right in the middle, so how do we drive those contracts locally? Second part of the leg of the stool was to start up new business enterprises that could provide the professional services to capture those contracts and put people to work in the neighborhoods. We organized them as worker cooperatives on the theory that our mantra was, a job alone is not enough. If you want to build enterprise in disinvested and even devastated neighborhoods among people who are quite poor, who may have barriers to employment such as low educational attainment, they may have been formerly incarcerated, merely providing a living wage job, as good as that is compared to being unemployed, that is insufficient, because all they are is one paycheck away from, the roof blows off their house, or their car is ruined, they can't get to work, they're pitched right back into poverty. So we have to find a way to help people build their assets and wealth. And so we organize these companies as worker-owned so that as they're profitable, people can share in the profits. There are 3 or 4 companies right now. There's several hundred people working in them. As I said, they're called the Evergreen Cooperatives. Now this idea has spread around the United States. We're working with about 40 cities that are building wealth in this way, reinvigorating the local economy and the basis of it. And I think I just leave you with a story, actually about two people. These are people who are owners of the Evergreen Cooperatives. Everybody who works there has an equal share in the company. They truly are business owners, even if they had been incarcerated for 10 years before, or even if they had only achieved a 5th year education. So one is Chris Brown, who's a very entrepreneurial man. He's a black man. He's in his early 40s. He's an ex-convict. He'd been incarcerated a good number of years. He was incarcerated because formerly his business had been, he was a dealer of crack cocaine in the neighborhoods. Now he is, after a couple years at Evergreen, he's a supervisor of a crew in his company. He is an owner of his company. He is buying a house in Cleveland that he's never been able to afford before. And earlier this year, we had a profit-sharing event. This was at our Evergreen Cooperative Laundry. It's doing tens of millions of pounds of healthcare bed linen. We had a profit-sharing event, and he received a check for $4,000. When the median household income in the neighborhood is $18,000. So $4,000 in Edinburgh may not be, US, may not be life-changing, but in neighborhoods in Cleveland, it can be life-changing. So that's one person. The other I wanted to tell you about, and I'll conclude, is a gentleman named Medrick Addison. Medrick was the second person we ever hired in Evergreen a number of years ago. When I met him, he had been incarcerated twice. He was living in his automobile, and we hired him to work in the Evergreen Laundry. I asked him about a month into his tenure on the job, what does this mean to you that you have this job? And I figured he would say, well, I've got a steady paycheck. You know, I've got cash in my pocket. Yeah. I can provide for him. He didn't say that. I undersold him. What he said is, I never thought a person like me could ever own a piece of a corporation like this. That to me is one of the most profound things I've ever heard, because it talks about the ceiling huge numbers of our people in your country and my country and others have on them, that because of the mistakes they've made or the strikes against them or the lack of education or whatever, they think they cannot rise and get ahead and join the economy in the way that we've all been privileged to. And so that, I think, is the ultimate opportunity here in focusing on place and providing the kind of inclusive growth and opportunity that we're all talking about. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you, Ted. I wrote down a job alone is just not enough, actually.
Surely.
What we'll do is we'll do questions after Neil, and Neil is here, and he is the Managing Director for the Centre of Local Economic Strategies.
Great.
So,
Cheers, Sandy. And lovely to be back. Nice being back in Scotland. I'm from Crieff, but I work in Manchester. So it's always brilliant. I can relax when I speak now, and understand what I'm saying. Fantastic. I work for the organisation Centre for Local Economic Strategies. We're UK's leading member organisation dedicated to progressive economics for people in place. And we've got two simple things. What we believe in. One is that we believe the economy, from the Greek word oikonomos, which means keeper of the household. We believe an economy needs to be brought back home, brought back to people, brought back to places, brought back to our communities. The economy is a social construct. It's something we can create any way we want. And unfortunately, the economy has been constructed or being constructed by people that is not working for people, place and communities. Otherwise, why would we have 1 million people in relative poverty in Scotland? Or why would we have 230,000 children in poverty in Scotland? Why is poverty in Scotland getting worse? These are key, biggest questions we face in Scotland. And I would say part of the root of that is an economy is going wrong. It's not rooted to our home, our place, our people, communities. And we need to bring it back home. And my organisation is a small think tank, work across the UK, as well as I've recently been to Slovenia and Auckland in New Zealand, to try and help local administrations and national governments to think through how they recalibrate the economy for inclusion, to bring an economy back home. And one aspect of this work is around local wealth building. And I've known Ted for many years. I'm very privileged to have Ted here in Scotland again. And you should invite him back, because he is an inspiration, and I don't say that lightly, and also we can learn a lot from him here in Scotland. But we've been trying to advance this agenda here in Scotland for 18 months, and I'm not calling anyone out, but it seems to me we need to get on this agenda in Scotland, and I explain why we need to get on this agenda in Scotland and why it needs to be taken forward. I know it's somewhere in the corridors of the Scottish Government at this point in time, and CLES's doors are always open, yeah, but we need to get going on this, I feel. And interestingly, it started, this work, in Scotland about 10 years ago for us. I was not going to name them, but I was in an old friend of mine, Director of Economic Development. He's no longer working there, but we're wandering around this place, and with the era of regeneration money flooding into this poorish place, yeah? Money coming in, lots of transfer payments, yeah, from the central government, the UK and Scottish, to this locality. And like great things, you go to the pub, things happen at the pub, and this person goes, "How's it going?" "It's going all right, you know, we get this money in, but it's still not changing the old fabric of people's lives." And you know, and in fact, even some of the pound shops are closing down. And then we got a few more beers, and we started talking, and it was like, you know what, there is a lot of wealth in this place though. We've got a university, we've got a local authority, we've got a hospital, we've got a big employer, yeah, we've got community activities. There's a lot of assets and wealth. We should be thinking more about all that stuff, opposed to thinking the big inward investment dream. And that got us thinking, and since then we at CLES have measured these anchor organisations across 4 different things. So all these hospitals, local authorities, who do they employ? Well, they employ local people. What are the goods and services do they buy? Chairs, catering. When they're constructing something, what construction companies do they buy? So that procurement. So first workforce, secondly procurement commission, third land, property, assets and investments, local government pension funds. Where does that go? Who gets that money? Land assets, who uses it? Yeah? And the 4th thing we got interested in was democratisation of the economy. How do we make sure that the economy, by the very way it functions, is socially virtuous? Not after the fact of growth. Growth, don't worry, poor person in Ferguson Park. We're going to get growth, and then it's going to trickle down to you. How do we get that person having a stake in the economy? And that means they own some bits of the economy, like the examples that Ted gave. Not after the fact of growth, but in fact, during the function of the economy itself. A lot of this is inspired by Ted's organisation, the Democracy Collaborative. And we started to think then, how could we do this? So we measured all these individual local authorities, hospitals, measured where the money goes, workforce. Then we thought, imagine thinking we could do this in a place, a whole place. All the anchor organisations, it's like in Cleveland. Now it's a long story, but Preston, Lancashire became that test bed, yeah? And it's 6 years work in Preston. And what's interesting about Preston is 130,000 people. It's got a hospital, sorry, it's got a university, it's got a hospital, it's got 2 local authorities, it's got a college, it's got 2 colleges, it's got a housing association. It's got lots of major anchors in that place, yeah? Also what's interesting about Preston is they were playing the mainstream economic development game. Prostitute yourself to a bit of global capital that will land, and one of the 5th most poorest places in England will see a land of milk and honey. All they need to do is to get the next bit of investment to land. In 2011, its plan for this was the Tithe Ban project, a £700 million project. After the GFC, there was nobody coming to Preston to invest. So they're knackered. So what did they do? They turned to this anchor approach. And in 2012, we measured all of the resources across 6 anchor organisations. Nearly £800 million of money across the Preston City Council, Lancashire County Council, Police and Crime Commissioner, UCLAN, the university, 2 colleges, yeah, £750 million, nearly £8 million, measured it. Where does it go? 5% of all that, in terms of procurement, in terms of spending, went to Preston. 39% went to Lancashire. We did a lot of hard graft work with many other people in Preston. And now we have 18% spend in Preston and 80% spend in the wider Lancashire. That represents £70 million of money back to the Preston's economy and represents £200 million back to the Lancashire economy. We estimate it's about 1,200 jobs. 4,000 people now receive the minimum wage, which the real living wage, which the hitherto did not do before this work started. Preston are now not one of the 20th most poorest places in England. It's now moved out of that and it's in the 40th. It's in the 40th most deprived. It's moved up. It's also seen a rise in social mobility within the area. So this is it transformed the economy of Preston, arguably, not just relying on inward investment, but working with the systemic change in the actions of those anchors within those places. And every place in Scotland has those anchors too. If we can turn them round, we can make some inroads into the 1 million people who live in relative poverty and the 230,000 children who are in relative poverty too. That's the Preston story, but there's other stories. The blend is different in different places. We're now working in 15 European locations, also the Wirral in Merseyside, Islington, Southampton, Oldham, Birmingham, Kirklees, a rural area in the Pennines. All of those stories are different blend of workforce, procurement, land property assets and democratisation of the economy. This movement's growing. We're also working with NHS England and the Health Foundation and the Democracy Collaborative, looking at the power of £110 billion of money within NHS England and how those health institutions could be used in terms of their workforce, their procurement, their land property and assets and democratisation of the economy. And NHS England are interesting because they know that wealth equals good health. They know that if there's people who have money in their pockets, they're less likely to be ill. They know that a job is a good route into not being ill. So they see it as they also see it as part of the foundation principles of the National Health Service. National Health Service were about free at the point of need, but it was also about these edifices, these institutions, as beacons of well-being in our community. A statement of an institution which looked after individuals in all of the aspects of their life. So it's restoring some of those foundation principles of NHS. That's an important bit of work, I feel. I'll probably finish there, but I would just reiterate that if we're talking about place and place development, the foundation element of this is wealth, and Ted says this a lot. Who has it, where does it go, and how do local people benefit? If we don't look after our anchor institutions in those localities who hold a significant portion of that wealth, it's a dereliction of democratic duty, and we're missing a massive trick. And at this point in time, I would argue, and I'm being bullish, because I'm in with my fellow Jock Thompson's bairns, I can maybe be so. Scotland needs to get on this agenda. Yeah, you're missing a trick if you don't. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you very much. Go with this one. I think we're going to go with 3 mics now, if that's okay. Thank you. And I think that was really inspiring talking. What we're going to do now is we're going to spend a wee while, if we can, to bring some questions. I'm sure there's quite a lot of questions because there's quite a challenge here for Scotland to get on the commission, on the route for that. And I think we've got some really good examples. So I'd just like to invite people to put their hand up and say who you are and what your question is, and then we can sort of field the answers if that's okay. So first question, please. There's one over there. Sir.
Sandy, John Centre from East Ayrshire Council. Quite often, a problem for people like myself who want a local authority to buy locally,
Yeah,
to be able to source things that we know that we can get at a reasonable price in the community, is hampered by the fact that there are procurement regulations and agreements and contracts that have been developed to get what I think is described as best value.
Yes.
Without necessarily telling you what best value actually means. How are you not in a danger of preaching to the converted at a meeting like this, and actually the people who need to hear what it is that you have to say are the people who make the regulations and the contract specifications and such and such?
That's a really good question. Who might they be?
Who might they be? Well, I couldn't possibly say.
John, that's a fair challenge, and you're spot on. I think that's right. I think clearly there needs to be, as there is happening in England at the moment and in other administrations, a serious consideration of cost, quality and wider social value to our procurement activities. And it's that wider value that needs to be brought in, and there does need to be a shift in regulations. I still think though there's some wiggle room within existing regulations in terms of the behaviours of some procurement departments and treasury departments, not just perhaps local authorities but other anchor organisations as well. So you're spot on. I think there does need to be a serious look at that in terms of the national policy, legislative, regulatory barriers, and I think that would be a first step in moving towards at a national level how you might unlock this. But I still think there's some wiggle room perhaps within other anchor organisations that could be more progressive in what they purchase.
And what I'll say comes out of my experience in the United States, and I know it's different, but what I've found is, at least in the US context, in these large institutions, whether it's the municipal authority or university or hospital, there needs to be a commitment and a kind of buy-in by the CEO or leader of that organization that we're going to explore how to do this, how to buy more local, how to invest more, and so forth. But that's insufficient. The top person needs to get behind this and be vocal, or no one will follow. There'll be no one to follow. But then it's almost a matter of looking at that institution. I'm thinking of a hospital in Cleveland that has 25,000 employees. It's almost, I consider it almost a community, and it's a community organizing strategy. How do you build support at all different levels? If the CEO says, we want to look at this, then how do you get the procurement people on board? How do you get the marketing people, the treasury people? And I'd be happy to share our experience. But we found at least there is a way to organize. And then I've also found, as Neil has, while some people just immediately say, well, no, we can't do that because of the XYZ regulation, creative people find interesting workarounds to make things happen. Just by way of one very quick example, in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, the mayor down there, Mayor Mitch Landrieu, he wanted to preference contracts going to local minority and women-owned businesses, SMEs, to put people to work. And you know, the unemployment rate among black men in New Orleans is something like 65%. So that was his, but the state legislature that was so conservative said, no, you can't do that. Because if you do that, that discriminates against white people. Hard to believe that argument still passes muster these days, but it did. So the mayor said, okay, what are we going to do? So he created a new designation called a disadvantaged business enterprise. Not at all based on race. We are going to purchase most of our stuff from disadvantaged business enterprises to build up our local small businesses. They began doing that, no one stopped them, and lo and behold, it turned out that over 90% of those disadvantaged business enterprises were owned by women and minorities. So there are clever ways to make things happen.
Plenty ways to skin a cat. There's another one at the back there. That's you.
Karen McLean from Scottish Government with responsibility for rural and island unity.
Cool.
So I was interested in what you
Yeah, it's a great.
So I don't know whether everybody heard that question. It's about the scale of the community, really. And I don't know if anybody that's on the side over that way, if you want to come over to be able to hear easier throughout this part of the conversation, but it was about the scale.
Carl, it's a great question, and I think we're still in the beginnings of this movement, if you like, as I kind of see it. And we've started at this, I think, it's come from a local government procurement perspective, first of all, maybe a larger local government. Then it's moved into ideas around the workforce of the local authority, but then other anchors. Then it's moved into land, property and assets, and now it's moving into this democratisation of the economy idea. And it's also moving around scale. And one of the area we're working on is a CLES, which is like Huddersfield, Todmorden. It's small, it's not quite as, it's more like a sort of, would you say, like a sort of, a bit like a sort of Perthshire, I suppose, a little bit like a Perthshire, with a number of towns, smaller towns. And there you're seeing in smaller areas, there's always wealth, yeah, of some description, yeah? There'll be some anchor organisation or some wealth. And so the principle's the same in terms of how you lock that in terms of how does that economy, the ecosystem lock in some of that wealth? Who owns the local shops? Could it be somebody, a local community that own the local pub? It's Development Trust Association, I think I've got a lot in this as well. There's different forms of wealth that it's extracted or slips away. The principle here is how do we lock that wealth in? And it can work in a small area as much as a large city. But the general principle is through workforce, through procurement, through land, property and assets, and through this democratisation of the economy, you end up to lock this place, lock the wealth in. Does that help?
The circular economy, is that?
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about scale? Okay, there's another question here.
Yeah, David Greer, North Lanarkshire Council. I have to agree, I mean, our biggest problem real is procurement, which holds us back.
Can you hear at the back? Go ahead to speak up just a wee bit.
Yeah, hi, David Greer from North Lanarkshire Council. I agree the biggest problem is procurement, and we do try and work around it by doing supplier chain training for local MSCs. Also using the hub model as well, which has helped a lot because they can actually put that in line. But I think another dichotomy we have is that through our procurement, more and more we're asking for SMEs to be paid the living wage.
Yeah.
And the problem exists that the margins aren't big enough for them to do that, so we have to basically look elsewhere.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I agree. It's sound, David. And there's two things to that. One is the kind of is the procurement practice, yeah, and there's questions of behaviours and questions of regulation, legislation. Then it's about the market itself, and there's something about how do we, and what they're doing in Preston and elsewhere now is they're spotting gaps in the market where there's too few entrants to it for a particular service. So then you get monopolies, and then you get inflated price, and it's not cost effective. And you see that in the care market in England. I know what the situation in Scotland is. There's a few large providers who are basically extracting wealth at the rate of knots at 10-12% return on social need. Yeah, and it's public money getting extracted. Some of them are owned by very, very distant shareholders. So, in terms of care, there is a need for economic development and business development practices to start to animate the market to plug in to the collective need of those anchor organisations. Catering is a good example in terms of how do you construct more entrants to the market through business development who can compete for procurement contracts. And now often economic development is separated from procurement. Economic procurement is one of the biggest tools that economic development has, but it's seen as about inward investment mostly. It actually needs to be connected up more. So a lot can be done by the system change inside the process of these anchors and how they link up supply with demand and with procurement practice.
Yeah, I'd like to, I guess, make a plea for the following. I completely agree with everything Neil said about the power of procurement and all that, but I would almost suggest setting that aside for a moment because there will certainly be lots of barriers, and urge that when you leave here, in addition to thinking about procurement and investment in land and real estate and such, set aside the specifics and look at the broad principle of what do we want to create.
Sure.
So, you know, if what everyone in the room wants to create is more jobs, if we say that's what our goal is, well, there are an awful lot of ways to do that. You know, in the United States, one way cities do it is they bundle up tens, hundreds of millions of dollars of public subsidies and give it to Walmart or some other company to come in and bring their jobs. Now, they're not really very good jobs. They often don't have health benefits. They don't have career ladders. But if we're going to be satisfied with that metric, then the mayor can say, look, I created 4,000 jobs. They're just not the jobs that anybody in this room would want. But if what the goal is to build wealth in the community, provide employment that can go from one generation to another, as they've done so effectively in Mondragon in Spain and the worker cooperatives there, then that's another approach. So this idea of what is, I just think this kind of work, and it's not talked about in economic development, but the importance of vision and being clear, what are we trying to achieve, just becomes essential. What I'm working on is how do we move beyond the kind of giant corporate capitalism, the failed limitations of state socialism. How do we bring about a truly democratic economy that is inclusive? And what does that mean? And that's a term of art that's being invented for all of us. But, you know, the way we began in Cleveland was we had no idea how to do any of the things we've done. We created something we called a Community Wealth Building Summit, or roundtable, and brought together representatives of anchor institutions and the faith community and the municipal authority and the Chamber of Commerce and local small businesses and universities and hospitals, and had conversation for possibility almost, and agreed on some principles, like a job alone is not enough, that then we interrogated and worked on and helped shape a strategy. So we were talking about how in rural communities there just may not be anchors. I will tell you, I've worked the last several years on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. It's the Oglala Sioux. Native Americans live there. This is a reservation on which the unemployment rate is somewhere between 80 and 90%. There is literally no place to work there. There are no anchor institutions. So a group of Sioux got together and created something called the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. Yeah. And then they found a way on these hundreds of thousands of acres of land at the reservation. They captured 35 acres of it that they owned. And then they started to build an intentional community. And in fact, they became an anchor institution. And they said, well, how are we going to build these new facilities, a cultural center, houses for our people, all this? Well, the traditional way to do it is they would drive 2 hours away from the reservation to Rapid City, South Dakota, and hire a white construction firm to come down and build it, and therefore all the money would leave the reservation. They said, why don't we create the Native American worker-owned construction company and build this ourselves? And oh, by the way, after we build this, let's go to Rapid City and build there and take their money and bring it back to the reservation. None of those ideas would be predictable at the beginning, but they were able to be in a big enough conversation that really extraordinary and unpredictable things could happen. And I think that's the opportunity that comes out of this conference and this very powerful conversation all of us are in. And would you like me to lower the blinds a bit? Would that be helpful?
I think in Scotland it's glad it's sunny, yeah.
Coming from
I'm not quite sure what to do.
Okay.
Logistics. Okay. So we'll just take one last question, if that's okay, just for this session, this part, and then we'll go into conversations round about the table, if that's okay. The gentleman with his hand up over there.
You capture the anchor organisations, the ones that as you go down the chain, they then don't
Yeah, at least in the United States, when I would have this anchor conversation 15 years ago, because that's how long I've been working on this, they would practically say, would you please leave now? We don't want to talk about this anymore. What's happened, though, is the institutions have started to understand, I think this is very, very important, why it is in their self-interest to conduct themselves in a kind of new business model. And we could talk about that, but that idea of why, as a health institution, it could actually be in your economic self-interest to participate in this way. And so we've now, in addition to working in about 40 communities in the United States, at the Democracy Collaborative, we've established a national network of hospitals and health systems called the Healthcare Anchor Network that represents $150 billion of endowment and investment portfolios and $50 billion annual procurement and so forth. All of them working on these strategies, and now we've just launched one in higher education as well. So this idea, I think, is starting to permeate, at least in the United States, institutions as almost just common sense, and that this thing really works. And I think that's what we're seeing out of Preston and elsewhere. One of the most interesting presentations I heard in Preston a couple years ago, I've been 5 or 6 times, was the head of the Lancashire Police Constabulary, who talked about why, as an anchor, that's how they're now thinking of themselves, not just a police force, why they are interested in local procurement as a cutting-edge activity of the police department. And for that officer, it was really quite extraordinary. He said, you know, this is not about us doing good, this isn't about charity. We believe if we can drive our money locally, we're going to create more jobs, people are going to be less likely to become criminals, and so we see this as sound policing, buying locally, and I think that's the kind of conversation we need to start to get going in all these institutions, how it's fundamental to their core mission.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree with that. And of course, what's happening in England and in Europe, of course, is that we're starting to see what we call, anchor partnerships. I suppose they're not like a community planning partnership. These are focused organisations with the intention to try and reorganise how they think about the economy and the wealth that they hold. And I was in one last week in Greater Manchester, which was all the great and the good, the universities, the Health and Social Care Partnership, the Manchester Airport Group were there, an anchor partnership meeting. And it's starting to infect how they practice inside their organisations, but also other anchors to come on board. The work in Birmingham started with 6. We've identified 37 anchors now, and some of those are starting to come on board too. So it does infect and spontaneously, I suppose, allow it changing other anchor behaviours as well. The other thing that's important about this is that it's infecting change within the supply chain, particularly in procurement, is that there's I think I can name them, a company in Preston called Michael Conlon, a local Preston businessman who has embedded social value and employed local people within his actual activities. And you're now seeing him forcing it down the supply chain of his organisation. So he will, when he wants something else, like be it bricks or whatever he needs, he's saying, hold on, are you employing local people? It's the suppliers of the suppliers, and then potentially the suppliers of the suppliers of the suppliers who are starting to be infected with this sense of social goodness. So, like many things in the world, you have to make the start, and there's ripple effects. We need to be conscious that those ripple effects are there and seek to amplify and scale them up wherever we can.
Thank you very much. So now I'd like to invite you to join into a conversation on your table, whether you split into 2 on your table or whether you can hear and you can all converse in one conversation. But what we're talking about is the ripple effect, actually. And what we want to find out really is where is it that you've heard of this working well? Where is it that it's not working well? What is it that we want to do to fix it? Who's going to fix it, and when are they going to do it? So there's quite a lot to talk about there. You've got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes to do that. Sort the world out. There's some folk right at the far end there. They might want to come in to join a different table. So I'll let you self-organise. What we'll do here is we'll go and join in the tables. We might move about a bit, if that's okay. But I'd like to invite you to say thank you in the normal way to the speakers this afternoon.